Here is Diplomat Deep Blue, a blue ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. Starting out, I get a blue I can really get behind. In the writing sample on the lab notebook, I had to prime the pen, something that I had to do a few times during the day of writing with this and another pen. It was a common issue with this ink. Now, given I experience flow issues associated with this ink, I see a lot of tone shift as most any pen doesn't really get to the ink to keep up. But in all the tone shift, it does shade. A more absorbent, non-fountain pen friendly paper will really bring this issue to the front of your writing experience. I like this blue, but not the flow issues. More on this in the nib and pen segment. So it will be a soft pass for me. I would use a sample happily, but not be happy with a bottle. The pen for today is a Parker Jotter with a medium nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Here we can see we get a nice vivid blue on the page very early in the writing. And it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it does shade fairly well, though on the first line, though the T is lighter than the H. It lightens up a little bit into the OU. The GH at the end does get darker again, while on the second line, the WH are lighter than the I, but the L lightens again with a very dark E at the end. Gives a very nice blue on the page when it is ready to write. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Diplomat Burgundy. Here is Diplomat Moss Green. Here is Diplomat Royal Blue. Here is Diplomat Orchid. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. The tone we're getting here is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, perhaps a result of a more absorbent paper. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. You see entire words like waste on the second line, no shading at all. But that right next to that has a lighter T, darker H, a lighter A, darker T. That is some very nice shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. We can easily continue writing back here. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. The tone we're seeing on the page is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Also, in person, I'm getting almost a very slight greenish feel about it. Not that it's a green ink, but you're starting to see it as like a dark turquoise with a very slight green lean. This is a result of the paper, meaning that the ink itself is a little bit more translucent. Not a problem. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. There's almost no shading, so it's not shading anywhere near like it did on the Clairfontaine, and it's not looking as good and enjoyable here. Again, as we're writing, let's remember that the ink is not keeping up with the pen. Looking at the back of the page, you see this ink does have spots where it gets more into the paper, showing that the more absorbent paper, this ink really runs into it. So you possibly could write back here. I probably wouldn't because of the spotting that's going on. Now, it did not touch the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. The tone we're getting here is definitely lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, certainly a result of the pen or the ink not keeping up with the pen, or the pen or any pen I have not really having the flow to really keep up with this. I suppose maybe something that's super, super wet might have been a good way to go, maybe. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. There is some shading, very light amount of shading, nowhere near like we had on the Clairfontaine. We can only spot a few areas, like the trees on the first line, where the T is a little bit lighter than, or sorry, the most of the word is fairly light. It's the top of the H that is a bit darker. In trees, next to that, it's the last S that does get a bit darker than the rest of the word. Going to the second line, at going, we see most of the word is light and the G is darker, but most all of it looks like the word moreover on the first line, one solid tone the whole way. It does stand out against this quad rule with no problem. The quad rule melts into the background, making this a good combination. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Birmingham Pen Company, USS Requiem Navy Blue. Here is Califolio Ocanto. Here is Diatramentis Document Blue. Here is Diamine Misty Blue.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. The tone we start out getting here is a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering, not spreading, not shading. You see the tremendous difference that really did happen once I primed the pen. It's like it becomes an entirely different blue. The ink just doesn't want to really keep up with the pens. Now, no feather, no spread, no shade, stands out against the quad rule, no problem. Even in its lighter tone, it's doing well, which would make it a good combination here. Though having to prime the pen could really slow you down in your student note-taking. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes here. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Electric Pink. Here is Diamine Blaze Orange. Here is Colorverse Andromeda. Here is J. Herban Amber de Bermenie.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. The tone on the page is certainly a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather. Very, very little. You see it a little bit on Oftener. You see it a little bit on Better on the second line. You see it a little bit on Halls on the first line. Not a big deal. There's a definite amount of spread that's going on. There's almost nothing for shading. I think I can spot one or two tiny spots that are a little bit darker, but that's about it. Overall, I'm going to call this good enough on this paper, but it's not something that I would necessarily run to use. Looking at the back of the page, you see how deep this really did get into the paper, though it did bleed through in only one spot, giving a little dot on the page underneath. Not necessarily a deal breaker, but you could not write on the back of this page or you would destroy both sets of notes. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The Parker Jotter is a wet medium, and I experienced an overshadowing flow issue. So off camera, I tried a gusher of a fine to overcome this, and failed. Constant flow issues. This does mean if you really love this, go for a gusher that is a piston filler to make it easier to prime the feed while writing, as this ink makes ink starvation an issue with most any pen. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.